I still remember the look on their faces when the water started creeping over their precious manicured lawns. The HOA board members, standing knee-deep in brown, debris-filled floodwater, clutching their designer raincoats like it was going to save them. They were shouting into their phones, calling insurance, contractors, anyone who would listen, but no one could stop it. See? They thought they were punishing me when they filled my creek with concrete, that little improvement project of theirs. They didn't realize that creek didn't just run through my property. It fed the drainage system for the entire row of multi-million-dollar lakefront homes. All I had to do was nothing. I let nature take the wheel. And when the spring rains came, so did their reckoning. And that's the funny thing about water, it always finds its way back. My name's Jack Miller. I'm 52 years old, a retired civil engineer, and a widower going on 7 years now. I live alone on 12 acres. My father left me a patch of rolling land with oak trees that bend in the wind and a spring-fed creek that runs like a silver ribbon from the north edge all the way to the lake. It's not a mansion, not by a long shot, but it's mine. Most mornings I'm up before dawn, making coffee while the mist still hangs low over the water. I take my old lab, Duke, down to the dock, and we just sit there. I watch the sun creep up behind the hills, painting the lake orange, and Duke stares at the ducks like he's making plans he'll never follow through on. There's something about those quiet minutes before the world wakes up. No phone calls, no traffic, just the sound of running water and the smell of pine. For most of my life, this place was a well-kept secret. A handful of us lived along the lake, and everybody minded their own business. We'd wave from a distance, maybe share a beer after a long day, but nobody cared what color your mailbox was or how tall your grass got. That changed about 5 years ago, when a developer bought up a chunk of farmland just downstream. In came the bulldozers, then the surveyors, then the parade of SUVs with out-of-state plates. The old pastures turned into gated driveways, and before long, rows of 3-story lake estates were standing where corn once grew. Now, I've got nothing against people wanting a nice place to live, but these weren't just new neighbors they brought the HOA with them. You could smell it before they even filed the paperwork. The first time I heard the term HOA president around here, I almost laughed. This wasn't a subdivision in the suburbs, it was rural county land. But sure enough, a few months later, there it was, the Lakeshore Community Association, with its glossy brochure promising standards and property value protection. And right at the center of it all was Karen Adams, late 40s, bleach blonde bob cut sharp enough to slice bread, sunglasses the size of tea saucers, and a smile that never reached her eyes. She'd moved into one of the biggest houses on the lake, a sprawling $5 million monstrosity with 3 decks and more glass than a downtown office tower. From day one, she acted like she'd been elected mayor of the entire lakefront. I met her officially at the first community mixer the HOA put on. She marched up to me with a clipboard and said, "Oh, you must be Mr. Miller. We've been meaning to talk to you about your property. Not hello, not welcome, just straight to business." She talked about improving the shared aesthetic and bringing everyone into compliance. I told her, as politely as I could, that my land wasn't part of her HOA, and I planned on keeping it that way. She laughed a little too long, a little too loud, and said, "We'll see about that." In the months after that, I kept my distance. I was content to let the newcomers have their wine tastings and pickleball tournaments as long as they stayed on their side of the fence. But every time I'd head into town, I'd see little signs of the HOA creeping in new speed limit postings on county roads, ornamental shrubs planted right up to the edge of the public boat ramp, even members-only parking spots at the lakeshore. Still, I figured if I just kept to myself, they'd forget about me. The thing about HOAs, though, is they don't forget, especially not Karen. When you've lived on the same land your whole life, you know every inch of it. I know where the deer like to bed down in winter, where the creek narrows enough to hop across without getting wet, and exactly how high the water gets after a hard rain. I know because I've been out there, boots in the mud, watching it happen for decades. That creek isn't just decoration. It's the lifeline that keeps the ground from turning into a swamp after storms. It carries runoff from the north fields, threads through my property, then feeds directly into the drainage channels that protect all those shiny new lake homes. It's nature's own flood insurance, and it's been doing its job since long before the first HOA meeting was called to order. To me, it's more than a waterway, it's history. My dad used to fish in it as a boy, and I've got memories of catching my first trout there with him, knee-deep in cold water, our breath fogging the air. Even now, there's nothing like standing on that old wooden bridge I built myself, leaning on the railing, and watching the current swirl around the rocks. So when someone starts talking about redirecting it or making improvements, my ears perk up. And when that someone is an HOA president with a history of meddling, I start paying real close attention. Still, back then, I hadn't realized just how far Karen was willing to go. Life rolled on. I kept fixing up the dock, mowing when I felt like it, and ignoring the occasional glossy flyer that showed up in my mailbox. Duke and I would still make our morning rounds down the slope to check the bridge, up past the old tool shed, then back along the creek. Everything seemed the same, except for the feeling in my gut. It was a kind of pressure you can't quite name, like when you know a storm's coming even though the sky is clear. And as I'd soon find out, the first rumble wasn't far off. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when I first realized the HOA had shifted from talk to action. I'd just come back from the hardware store with a box of deck screws and a new fishing line when Duke started barking. Not his "there's a squirrel" bark. This was the deep, steady one he used when something didn't belong. Through the front window, I saw a white SUV parked crooked at the end of my driveway. 3 people stood by the hood, talking in low voices. One of them tall, bleach blonde, sunglasses even though it was cloudy, was unmistakable. Karen Adams, clipboard in hand like she was inspecting a crime scene. By the time I stepped onto the porch, they were already walking toward me. Karen was flanked by a short man in a tailored vest and another woman I'd never seen before. The man carried a rolled-up map. The woman had a tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Karen said, voice sugary enough to rot teeth. "We're here to discuss some upcoming improvements in our community." I let the silence hang for a beat before answering. "My land's not in your community. Mrs. Adams, we've had this conversation." Her smile didn't budge. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear this. The board has approved a beautification project for the lakeshore area, which will include rerouting parts of the creek to allow for expanded HOA landscaping. It will really elevate the look for everyone." I folded my arms. "That creek isn't yours to touch." The man in the vest cleared his throat. "We have preliminary surveys that suggest the waterway is a shared feature." I took a step forward. "Preliminary surveys are worth the paper they're printed on. I've got deeds and water rights that say otherwise." Karen's smile tightened into something closer to a smirk. "Jack, no one's trying to take anything from you. We're just talking about a little cooperation. If you don't want to be a part of the HOA officially, fine. But we can still make sure your property aligns with the community's vision. And if I say no, I asked." She clicked her pen. "Then I'd hate for you to deal with the hassle of code enforcement visits or unexpected inspections. It's amazing what little things can trip someone up." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about landscaping. Karen wanted control, plain and simple. I kept my voice calm. "You've made your position clear. Now get off my property." The man in the vest started to protest, but Karen put a hand on his arm and turned back toward the SUV. "We'll be in touch." "Mr. Miller." They drove off, tires spitting gravel. I stood there for a long moment, Duke at my side, watching them disappear down the road. 3 days later, I found the first survey marker. It was a little orange flag stuck in the ground about 20 feet from the creek bank, right in line with the old oak tree I'd used as a landmark since I was a kid. A few yards farther down, another flag, and then another, a neat line leading straight toward my dock. I followed them all the way to the property line, where they veered sharply into my neighbor's yard. My neighbor, a quiet guy named Carl, came out when he saw me. "You get these too?" he asked, pointing to the flags. "Yeah," I said. "You know what they're for?" Carl shook his head. "No one's talked to me. Just woke up to find them here. But I heard they're planning some kind of big project by the water." That night, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, just a printed letterhead from Lakeshore Community Association. Inside was a list of requested compliance actions, including repainting my dock to match the approved color palette, removing my wooden bridge, and addressing non-conforming vegetation along the creek. I tossed it straight into the burn barrel. The next week, a county vehicle pulled into my drive. A young inspector stepped out and explained they'd had a complaint about unsafe structures on my property. When I asked who filed it, he shrugged. Anonymous. We walked down to the dock together. He looked around, made a few notes, and said, "Everything looks fine to me. Sir, sorry for the trouble." But I could tell from his tone that I wasn't the first stop on his list that day. The thing about people like Karen is they don't just attack head-on. They probe. They test boundaries. They look for the smallest crack to wedge open. And once they find it, they push until something breaks. By mid-April, it was clear she wasn't backing off. HOA landscapers showed up by mistake and trimmed the wildflowers along my creek bank down to stubs. A chain appeared across the shared road, forcing me to detour an extra mile to get to town. Someone even left a bright orange notice of violation sign in my driveway, not from the county, just something the HOA had mocked up. Each time, I documented everything. Photos, dates, even short videos on my phone. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it all, but I knew enough to keep records. Then came the kicker. One Saturday morning, I spotted two men in reflective vests standing knee-deep in the creek about 50 yards from my bridge. They were holding long poles and scribbling on clipboards. I called out, asking what they were doing. One of them mumbled something about hydrology assessments and kept working. Hydrology assessments. Out here, without telling the property owner, I felt that same storm warning pressure in my gut again. Only this time, the clouds were starting to gather for real. The thing about people like Karen is that they mistake silence for surrender. I've learned that over the years, stay quiet too long, and they think they've won. And once they believe that, they start pushing harder. It didn't take long for the little annoyances to turn into full-blown harassment. The first real escalation came on a windy Thursday morning. I woke to the sound of a motor running somewhere down by the water. When I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, I saw a landscaping crew in neon vests working along the creek. Only they weren't trimming grass or planting flowers, they were digging. Two of them were knee-deep in the bank, shovels throwing dirt like they were racing a clock. I walked down, Duke trotting ahead of me. "Morning, fellas," I said, voice flat. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my property?" The taller one froze mid-shovel. "We're with the Lakeshore Community Association," he said carefully. "Just doing some erosion control work." I pointed at the stake line. "That's the property boundary. You're 20 feet over it. Pack up and move on." They didn't argue. They just loaded the shovels into the truck and drove off. But not before one of them muttered something I couldn't quite hear. The next day, a letter arrived, this one, an official-looking envelope from the HOA's attorney. It claimed I was in violation of community safety standards for having an unpermitted bridge structure and an unsightly dock in visible disrepair. It warned of potential civil remedies if I didn't take immediate corrective action. I knew enough to recognize it for what it was, an intimidation tactic. Still, it stung. That bridge was something I'd built with my own hands, using reclaimed timber from my father's old barn. It had weathered 20 years of floods without a single repair beyond a fresh coat of sealant every few seasons. 2 days later, the chain across the shared road got a lock. Before, it had just been looped loosely for show, easy enough to unhook if you lived there. Now it was padlocked tight. I had to drive an extra 4 miles around the back roads just to get to the hardware store. When I asked the county about it, they shrugged. Turns out the HOA had gotten temporary traffic control approval for community safety. Carl, my neighbor, was just as irritated. "They're trying to box you in," he said one afternoon, leaning on the fence. "Heard Karen telling folks at the mixer you're a holdout like this is some kind of hostage negotiation." It didn't stop there. One morning, I found my mailbox door hanging open and my mail soaked from overnight rain. The latch had been bent like someone pried it with a screwdriver. A week later, someone dumped a load of gravel at the entrance to my driveway. No note, no explanation. The delivery company swore it wasn't them. And every few days, I'd find more of those little orange survey flags sprouting in my yard like weeds. The breaking point came one humid afternoon in May. I was down by the dock, sanding the railing, when Duke started growling low. I turned to see two kids, maybe late teens, on dirt bikes, tearing up the far bank of the creek. They were spinning their tires, sending chunks of sod into the water, laughing like it was a game. I waved them off, but they just revved louder. "Private property!" I yelled over the noise. One of them shouted back, "Karen said it's community land." Then they sped off toward the subdivision. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad. I listed every incident since that first knock on my door dates. Descriptions, photos. The list filled 2 full pages. Looking at it all laid out like that, I felt the slow burn in my chest turn into something sharper. They weren't just being petty. They were trying to wear me down, to make life so frustrating that I'd either give in or make a mistake they could use against me. But here's the thing Karen didn't understand. I'm not a man who scares easy. And I've spent a lifetime solving problems that involve water, weight, and pressure. I know how small changes in the right place can shift an entire system. By early June, I started noticing something strange. The creek's water level seemed off. Not by much, but enough for a man who'd spent decades watching it to know something wasn't right. The current was slower. The surface was a little muddier. And on still mornings, I could see ripples where there shouldn't have been any. One Saturday, I walked the length of my property along the creek. About 100 yards past my bridge, I found fresh tire tracks leading to the bank. A section of mud had been disturbed recently, the kind of churn you see when heavy equipment's been parked there. When I crouched down, I saw bits of gray dust in the dirt. Cement dust. That was when I knew this wasn't just harassment anymore. They were doing something to the creek. And if they were doing what I thought they were, it wasn't just going to cause me trouble. It was going to backfire on them in a way they hadn't imagined. I stood there for a long time, the evening light turning the water gold. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of machinery. My hands tightened into fists without me thinking about it. The storm in my gut. Yeah, it was here now. The next morning, I decided to confirm my suspicion. I took my old waders from the shed, grabbed my camera, and followed the creek beyond my property line. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the water was sluggish, almost lazy. Duke padded along the bank, stopping now and then to sniff at disturbed soil. About a quarter mile downstream, I found it. 2 men in hip waders were standing in the middle of the creek, up to their knees in murky water, working around a plywood form braced against the banks. One was pouring from a bucket. The other was smoothing something under the surface with a trowel. The smell of wet cement hit me hard. I didn't step into view right away. Instead, I crouched low behind a clump of willow branches and started snapping photos. Wide shots to show the location, close-ups to capture the tools, the fresh pour, the cement slurry swirling in the water. Then I zoomed in on their faces clear enough to identify. When I finally stood and walked toward them, they froze. "You boys got a permit for that?" I asked, letting the question hang heavy. The taller one cleared his throat. "We're contracted by the HOA, improving the waterway." I tilted my head. "By blocking it," the shorter man shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following orders." I pointed toward the bank, whose orders neither answered. They just grabbed their tools and started moving toward the pickup parked under a maple tree. I kept my camera up the whole time, snapping until the tailgate slammed shut and they sped off, leaving muddy tire ruts in their wake. Back at the house, I uploaded the photos to my computer, tagging each with the date and GPS coordinates. Then I dug out the old filing cabinet where I kept my father's property records. I found what I was looking for in a manila folder labeled Water Rights, Miller Property. The document was older than me, typed on yellowed paper. It was an easement agreement from 1948 signed by the county and my grandfather. It clearly stated that the creek was part of a regulated drainage system feeding into what was now the Lakefront development. The agreement required that no obstruction shall be placed within the waterway that inhibits or alters the natural flow. And here's the kicker, the penalty clause. Any party causing obstruction was liable for all damages resulting from flooding downstream, including property loss. It was a gold mine in legal terms, and I knew exactly who'd be on the hook if things went sideways. Still, I wanted more confirmation, so I called an old friend, Larry Daniels, who'd worked in the County Water Authority for 30 years before retiring. Larry was the kind of guy who knew every culvert and drainage ditch in 3 counties. When I told him what I'd found, he let out a low whistle. "Jack, if they're pouring concrete in that creek, they're playing with dynamite. That water's the only thing keeping runoff from backing up into the subdivision. If you get a heavy rain with that blocked, those basements will fill up faster than a bait bucket." "You're sure?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd bet my pension on it. "And if you've got photos and that easement agreement, you're holding all the cards." I hung up feeling something I hadn't in weeks control. That afternoon, I took a slow walk along the creek, snapping more pictures of sediment buildup and slowed current. I even shot a short video showing a leaf floating toward the blockage and stopping dead against the concrete lip. The more I thought about it, the clearer the strategy became. If I tried to remove the obstruction myself, they'd spin it as vandalism. If I went to the HOA directly, they'd deny everything. But if I let it be, let the obstruction do its work, nature would deliver my message for me, backed by county law. Of course, I still needed proof tying it directly to the HOA. The contractors had been careful not to name Karen outright, but I knew her fingerprints were all over this. The break came 2 days later, when Carl stopped by. He was carrying a beer and a grin. "You'll want to hear this," he said, leaning on the porch railing. Turns out Carl's sister-in-law worked for one of the landscaping companies the HOA used. She'd overheard Karen herself bragging at a planning meeting about taking control of that creek problem and how a little concrete now saves a lot of headaches later. She didn't know about the easement, did she? I asked. Carl laughed. She didn't even know there was one. That was all I needed. Between the easement, the photos, the video, and the witness statement, I had enough ammunition to make her regret every step she'd taken onto my property. But I wasn't going to fire just yet. No, this was the kind of shot you take only once, and you wait until the conditions are perfect. I tucked the easement back into its folder, slid it into my desk drawer, and poured myself a glass of sweet tea. Outside, the sky to the west was darkening, the kind of thick, rolling clouds that promised a week's worth of rain, and all I had to do was nothing. I didn't have to wait long for Karen to realize something wasn't going according to her plan. 3 mornings after I caught her crew in the creek, a certified letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the kind lawyers like to use when they want to look important. Inside was a formal notice of violation from the Lakeshore Community Association, signed by Karen herself as president. The accusations were laughable. My dock was structurally unsound, my wooden bridge was a hazard to wildlife, and my property contained unapproved materials that detracted from the visual harmony of the community. At the bottom, in bold, it warned that if I did not address all violations within 30 days, the HOA would pursue all available legal remedies. The kicker, they'd CC'd their attorney. I almost choked on my coffee reading it. My property wasn't even in their HOA, but here they were, writing letters like they had jurisdiction over my doormat. I decided not to respond. That silence must have irritated Karen because a week later, she upped the ante. It started with the fishing spot. I went down to the lake one morning and found the little bench I'd built just a couple of planks nailed to a log frame, smashed to pieces. The boards were splintered, the frame kicked apart. Footprints in the mud led straight toward the subdivision. That afternoon, I noticed the pump that fed my garden irrigation wasn't running. When I checked it, the power cable had been cut clean through. I found the severed end lying a few feet away. Like whoever did it wanted me to see it. Petty, sure, but it was also calculated little inconveniences designed to eat at me. Then came the public show. One Saturday, Carl and I went to the general store in town. While I was picking up feed, I overheard Karen holding court in the bakery section, telling anyone who'd listen about that stubborn old man upstream who was hoarding community resources and refusing to modernize. She talked like I was some kind of outlaw holding the neighborhood hostage. People like that ruin property values. She said loudly enough that I knew it was meant for me to hear. I didn't take the bait, but when I got home, I added it to my notes. The following week, a man in a suit showed up at my door. He introduced himself as the HOA's legal counsel and handed me a folder. Inside was a demand for immediate access to inspect all structures on my property. They were claiming my dock and bridge posed safety risks that affected shared waterways. I smiled, handed the folder back, and said, "You can leave now. And don't come back without a court order." He left without another word, but I knew it wasn't the end. That night, Duke woke me up barking at something down by the creek. I grabbed my flashlight and walked the path to the bank. On the far side, in the shadows, I caught a glimpse of two figures in hoodies moving toward the subdivision. When I checked the creek bed in the morning, I found fresh footprints near the concrete blockage and more cement dust. They weren't just maintaining the obstruction now, they were reinforcing it. That was when the irritation in my gut turned to a cold, steady focus. The kind you get when you know a game is being played and the other side is about to walk right into their own trap. I decided to give them just enough rope. The next day, I drove into town and bought a fresh set of trail cameras. I placed one on a tree overlooking the blockage and another near the path from the subdivision. Both were motion activated, both camouflaged to blend into the bark. Then I sat back and waited. Within a week, I had exactly what I needed: crisp, clear footage of the same two workers I'd caught before, mixing cement and packing it into the creek bed. The timestamp, GPS data, and their matching uniforms were all in plain view. But the real prize came on the third night. Karen herself appeared on camera, standing on the bank in her oversized sunglasses even though it was nearly dark, pointing and gesturing while the workers nodded. She was directing the whole operation like she was hosting a backyard barbecue. I copied the files, backed them up in 3 places, and stored the originals in a safe. Meanwhile, nature was starting to notice their handiwork. The water upstream of the blockage was higher than usual for early summer, pooling into low spots along the bank. Downstream, the current was sluggish, algae beginning to bloom where the flow had slowed. It was exactly the kind of environmental impact the county took seriously. Still, I didn't call them not yet. I wanted Karen and her board to keep feeling safe, to believe they'd boxed me in. The heavier the rain when it finally came, the better. When the forecast turned in my favor, I made my final preparations, every document copied, every photo printed, every video clip labeled. I even drafted a simple cover letter addressed to the County Water Authority, the state environmental agency, and the HOA's own insurance provider. All I'd need to do was drop it in the mail. In the meantime, I kept my routine exactly the same, fishing in the mornings, mowing the field, waving to the few neighbors who still spoke to me. On the surface, it looked like I'd given up. Karen must have thought she'd won. I could tell by the way she strutted past my property in her tennis whites, stopping to inspect the creek like she owned it. She had no idea she was standing on the edge of her own undoing, and the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, she didn't see those either. By the time July rolled around, the sky had that heavy, swollen look it gets before the summer monsoons. You could smell the rain in the air even on clear days, and every evening, dark clouds gathered along the western ridge before breaking apart. The ground was already soft from weeks of light showers. All it needed was one real downpour. I spent that time tightening every bolt of my plan. First, I called Larry Daniels again. "You remember that easement?" I asked him. "How could I forget? Sounds like someone's about to learn what strict liability means." I told him about the footage, the witness, and the new cement work. There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "Jack, if you send that to the county with the weather forecast we've got coming, they'll be on that site so fast Karen's head will spin. But if you're looking for maximum impact, I am." I said, "Then wait for the first real flood risk alert. Let them panic while you're already holding the match." It was good advice. Next, I reached out to an old contact at the state's Department of Environmental Quality. I didn't give my name, just described a situation involving an HOA blocking a regulated waterway. She told me it was a major violation and that inspectors respond aggressively when there's active risk to downstream property. She also reminded me that violations can carry both civil penalties and personal liability for board members. That nugget was worth its weight in gold, especially for a woman like Karen, whose image was built on being the glamorous, untouchable face of the community. I made 3 identical binders, each thick with evidence, copies of the 1948 easement agreement, and all attached maps. Photographs of the blockage, from initial pour to the most recent reinforcement. Video stills of the workers and Karen on site. The trail camera footage itself, labeled and time-stamped. A sworn statement from Carl's sister-in-law detailing Karen's admission. Weather data and floodplain maps showing projected water flow if the blockage remained. Each binder went into a waterproof case. One stayed locked in my gun safe. The other two were sealed in mailing boxes, addressed to the County Water Authority and the state DEQ. All I needed was to signal a heavy rain forecast and I'd send them overnight. But I wasn't just playing defense. I wanted Karen to keep digging her own hole, so I baited the hook. One muggy afternoon, I walked down to the blockage while they were working and stood just far enough away for Karen to see me. She was in capri pants and a wide brim hat, directing the crew with that bossy hand wave of hers. I didn't say a word, just took out my phone, aimed it at the concrete, and slowly panned from the obstruction to her. Then I smiled, waved, and walked away. She yelled something after me, probably a threat, but I didn't catch it. That little performance was for her benefit, to make her wonder if I was bluffing or not. People like Karen hate uncertainty. It makes them careless. Sure enough, within a week, I heard from Carl that Karen was telling people the creek was completely under control and there's nothing Miller can do about it. Perfect. The day before the storm finally came, I drove into town for supplies. Folks at the feed store were buzzing about the forecast 3 days of steady rain, maybe more. I bought extra fuel for the generator, stocked up on food, and made sure Duke had enough kibble to last 2 weeks. That night, I walked the creek one last time. The blockage looked even bigger now. The water pooled higher than ever behind it. You could hear it pressing against the concrete, a dull, constant push. The air was thick and still, like the whole valley was holding its breath. I sat on the dock until after dark, sipping coffee and listening to the first distant rumbles of thunder. In my mind, I could see it already, the water rising, spilling over the banks, inching toward those manicured lawns and glass-walled living rooms. And when it did, I wouldn't have to say a word. The binders would do the talking for me. I slept like a baby that night. The rain started before sunrise, slow at first, just a steady tapping on the tin roof. By mid-morning, it was coming down hard enough that the creek had turned the color of chocolate milk. I stood under my porch awning, watching branches float past at a speed I hadn't seen in years. By the second day, the water was a foot higher than normal, lapping at the underside of my bridge. I checked the trail camera feeds from my laptop. They showed the blockage holding, the pool behind it swelling wider and deeper. Downstream, the water was crawling, barely moving at all. That was when I slipped the 2 mailing boxes into the back of my truck and drove to the post office. The clerk stamped them overnight, priority, and slid them into the outgoing bin. By the time the county and state opened those packages in the morning, the evidence would be undeniable. And if the weather held, the damage would already be underway. All I had to do now was sit back and let the water do what it's been doing for thousands of years, find its own path, no matter who tries to stand in the way. By the morning of the third day, the rain had stopped pretending. Sheets of water hammered the roof, running in rivulets down my porch steps. The creek behind my house was roaring, white-capped in places, pressing against its banks like an animal straining at a leash. I knew the blockage was close to breaking point, not because I'd seen it collapse, but because I knew exactly how much pressure that much water could exert. Concrete or no, nature doesn't negotiate. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. It was Carl. "You've got to see this," he said. "Road by the subdivision's underwater. They've got sandbags out front of the big houses." I pulled on my raincoat, loaded Duke into the truck, and drove the long way around. Sure enough, the Lakefront Boulevard looked like something out of a bad newsreel. Waist-high water lapped at the edges of driveways, creeping into manicured flower beds. A couple of the homes already had water trickling into their garages. And there, right in the middle of it, was Karen hair plastered to her head. Sunglasses nowhere in sight for once, barking orders at 2 younger men stacking sandbags in front of her 3-tiered deck. She spotted me instantly. Her eyes narrowed, and she waded toward me through knee-deep water. "This is your fault," she shouted over the roar of the rain and rushing water. I let her get close enough to see the binder in my hand. "No, Karen," I said evenly. "This is your doing." She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound of sirens cut her off. 2 county trucks pulled up on the higher ground at the end of the street. Behind them, a white van with the Department of Environmental Quality logo. Inspectors in bright rain gear stepped out, scanning the flooded street before their eyes locked on me. "You, Miller," one of them called. "That's me." I walked toward them, binder held high to keep it dry. "Everything you need is in here: photos, dates, maps, witness statements. And before you ask, yes, the obstruction's still in place. Your guys can follow me back and see it for themselves." One of the inspectors glanced at Karen, who was now trying to smile like none of this was a big deal. "We'll start with the evidence," he said. "Then we'll take a look at the site." Karen's voice cracked. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. We were doing community improvements, ma'am," the inspector said. "If you've altered a regulated drainage channel without a permit, that's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of state law." I could almost hear the gulp she swallowed. They followed me in a convoy back to the blockage. The trail camera was still in place, but we didn't need it now. The scene spoke for itself. The creek was backed up into a massive pool, the concrete structure holding like a dam. Water foamed and churned against it, spilling over the sides into the surrounding brush. The lead inspector shook his head. "This is a disaster waiting to happen." I handed him the printed easement agreement. "It's not just a disaster, it's also a breach of contract with the county, and I've got witnesses tying it directly to the HOA president. They took photos, measurements, even chipped a sample of the concrete for lab confirmation. One of them radioed for a crew to start an emergency breach. By the time they were packing up, Karen had arrived, slogging through the mud in brand new rain boots. "We can work this out," she said to the inspector, forcing a brittle smile. "There's no need for ma'am," he interrupted. "You and your board are being cited for multiple violations. You'll receive formal notice within 72 hours. In the meantime, this structure is being removed under emergency order." Her face drained of color. "You can't." He held up the easement I'd given him. "We can. And we are. I didn't stick around for the demolition. I'd seen enough concrete get torn out in my career to know how it would end. Instead, I drove back to my place, poured myself a coffee, and watched the rain ease off around noon. By the next morning, the creek was flowing free again, but the damage downstream was done. Several of the million-dollar homes had waterlogged basements, ruined flooring, and warped cabinetry. The HOA was already scrambling to explain to their insurance providers why the flooding didn't qualify as an act of God. I didn't have to lift a finger. The county and state handled everything, from enforcement to fines. And the best part, every conversation, every inspection, every citation was public record. Within a week, Karen stopped making her morning inspection walks. By the end of the month, a moving truck sat in her driveway. She left without saying a word. The lake looked quieter after that. When the rain finally let up for good, the valley smelled of wet earth and cedar. The air was still heavy, but the sky had cleared enough to see the ridge again. The creek behind my house was running strong, its current bright and fast, carrying away the last bits of silt from the blockage. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without that low hum of tension in my chest. News traveled fast in a place like ours. By the time the DEQ issued their official report, most of the neighborhood already knew what had happened. The HOA board had been hit with state and county fines totaling 6 figures, not counting the cost of restoring the creek and repairing the downstream damage. Their insurance company wasn't covering a dime, thanks to the clear evidence of willful negligence. And Karen. She didn't last long after that. Rumor had it she tried to pin the whole thing on the other board members. But the trail camera footage with her standing at the site made that impossible. She put her house on the market 2 weeks later and vanished before the first open house. I can't say anyone missed her. Carl and I sat on my dock the day after she left, sipping beer and watching Duke nose around in the grass. "You realize you didn't actually do anything," he said, shaking his head. "That's the beauty of it." I told him I didn't have to. Nature did the heavy lifting. I just made sure the right people were watching. Life slid back into its old rhythm faster than I expected. The HOA seemed to shrink overnight without Karen's constant posturing. They focused on their own yards instead of mine. The chain across the road disappeared. No more survey flags sprouting in my grass. No more mystery gravel loads in my driveway. One evening in late August, I took my coffee down to the bridge. The water was low and clear, the stones on the bottom sharp in the golden light. I leaned on the railing I'd built with my father's old tools and thought about how close I'd come to losing this place, not because they had the power, but because I almost let them make me believe they did. People like Karen operate on one principle: if they can't control you outright, they'll try to wear you down until you give them permission. They don't expect you to stand your ground, and they sure as hell don't expect you to understand the system better than they do. The creek gurgled under my feet, and somewhere in the cottonwoods, a mourning dove called. Duke settled beside me with a sigh, the way dogs do when they know the day's work is done. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the County Water Authority, not a summons or a notice, but a thank you. They'd used my case as an example in a training session for new inspectors, a reminder of why easement laws exist in the first place. That letter's in my desk drawer now, next to the old easement agreement, not because I need proof anymore, but because it reminds me of something important when you've got the truth, the law, and a little patience on your side. You don't need to shout to win. These days, when I see the HOA folks at the general store, we nod politely and move on. They don't wave invitations in my face anymore. They don't ask me to modernize or beautify. And I don't bring up the flood. We all know what happened. We just leave it sitting there, unspoken, like a weathered log at the bottom of the lake, always there. Even if you can't see it from the surface, I'm fine with that. Because out here, on my 12 acres, the creek is flowing free again. The dock is sturdy under my feet. And the only board meeting I have to attend is the one Duke and I hold at sunrise with a cup of coffee and the sound of water running past. Sometimes the hardest part of a fight isn't swinging back. It's standing still long enough for your opponent to beat themselves. When someone comes after what's yours, the instinct is to meet force with force, but patience can be sharper than any weapon. I could have ripped out that concrete the day I found it. I could have shouted, threatened, even taken them to court right then. But that would have made me the villain in their story. Instead, I let their arrogance do the work, let nature take the wheel. And when the time came, I had every piece of proof lined up. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone watching this, it's this: know your rights, keep your records, and never underestimate the quiet power of letting someone walk straight into their own consequences. What about you? Have you ever had to outweight someone who is gunning for you? Tell me your story in the comments, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more where this came from.